And so why don't we accept that as a reality? So for years we talked about it in terms of failure. Our experience now, spending years talking about failure, is it doesn't generate a very compelling audience. And in fact,
Right.
several years ago there was a failure conference called FailCon in San Francisco, and it didn't work. Okay, and so we're saying,
pretty funny.
maybe there's another language we can use. So Charlie, my partner in this venture, several years ago started talking about, well, suppose you take a step and it really doesn't quite turn out the way in which you expected. Okay, well, you assess current reality, and quite likely you've just learned something that nobody else knows.
Right.
So one whole piece of it is to basically say this is an opportunity for learning. The new language of entrepreneurship is you pivot. Okay?
Pivot.
Yeah, and essentially it says nothing ever ends up the way in which you think it's going to end up. And so the reality is you pivot. And so people are studying business plans, people are studying business ventures, and all of a sudden it hasn't got a stigmatized language system of failure.
Yeah, that's good.
And the romanticized, you've learned something that nobody else knows.
Right.
Pivot is an inevitable process that one goes through in their life.
Is that your next title of your next book?
Well, actually, it's funny. This will be on several months after my commencement speech. Okay, so I can tell you what I'm going to talk about without actually stealing the thunder. And so the title of my commencement speech this year is "The Courage to Pivot," and it takes a portfolio of undergraduate and graduate students, okay, who came to Babson absolutely clear about what they wanted to do, okay, and who discovered at some point in the process that they didn't want to do it. And so once you discover that everything you dreamt about, fantasized about, or planned for wasn't what you want to do, what do you do with that? And for a lot of people, that's a demoralizing, paralyzing story. What we have is a portfolio of 4 or 5 undergraduates and 4 or 5 graduate students who really turned it into magic, okay, and ended up in their pivot, okay, ending up doing extraordinary things that none of them could have ever dreamt about before they got in the middle of the day-to-day in an experience in an environment like this.
And truly, for any of us who, at any point in life, you cannot predict what your future is going to look like, period.
When I retired from Limited Brands as Vice Chairman and Chief Operating Officer, it was the end of 2007. Okay, the one thing I was absolutely certain about was I was not going back to academia, and the thing that was even more certain was I certainly wasn't going back to academic administration. Okay, and here I am, just finishing my 4th year. So sometimes there's this marvelous opportunity to live, okay, and actually make hay out of the opportunities and conversations that emerge, and not be wedded, literally not be wedded to a detailed plan, particularly in an environment that is uncertain as the environment we're in today.
That's great. So what excites you today about entrepreneurship? What gets you excited?
What excites me is it's the ability for millions, if not billions of people to begin to take action on their aspirations, okay? and to not paralyze themselves into either believing they have to lead a scripted life, okay, with that script either coming from parents or friends or books or school, okay, and to have the enthusiasm and the commitment to actually pursue things that are just interesting in the moment, and also fundamentally recognizes that there are billions of people in the world who without entrepreneurship in today's world can't live, okay, and so the issue is, can we in fact, okay, develop mechanisms that enable them to use these tools in new and different ways to live better. The story of Muhammad Yunus and microfinance celebrates what he was able to do with $28. Okay, that was a long time ago. We know a lot more about microfinance, and we know a lot more about the processes by which people can engage in both necessity and opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. And he coined a phrase about 7 or 8 years ago that said, "We are all entrepreneurs, only too few people get to practice it." My ambition is to actually build a world where everybody is comfortable with the notion of acting on their own behalf or the behalf of the ideas that they care deeply about through just starting.
Just starting. That's great. So, what's next for you?
I don't know. The coolest thing about this is one of our former faculty members who, when we started getting into all of this work, was talking about the action process and said she always told her students, it doesn't matter what you're going to do. What matters is what you're going to do next. Okay, and that's what you should really spend time focusing in on. What you're going to do next. What you're going to do in the absolute point of a lifetime. It will sort itself out.
Right.
But focus on that next step. So the reality is, I have lots of different steps. I have the next step of what are Charlie and Paul going to do with me on the process of picking up where Just Start leaves off and figuring out what comes next there.
Right.
How does that evolve into the ability to actually build an influence network to touch as many people as is physically possible? I happen to be the president of college. How do I leverage the asset of being the #1 school in the world for entrepreneurship education to continue to evolve the most extraordinary place-based educational model for our undergraduates that we can possibly do, and to use the learning and the capacity that comes from that to figure out other populations we can reach and other people we can influence with our knowledge and awareness. So there is a picture. There is a picture for me about a world that is increasingly touched by the tools that are available to people to take action on things that they care about. It is a world that is able to address not only issues of economics, but issues of human outcomes and sustainability-oriented outcomes. Here at Babson, we were one of the first schools to endorse the UN Principles for Responsible Management Education, to recognize that there is a new capitalism that is able to address the issues of economic, human, and sustainability outcomes simultaneously rather than sequentially. So I'm driven by a set of principles, and I'm driven by a set of beliefs. I am incredibly opportunistic, okay? In terms of what comes next will be largely driven by what shows up in my inbox or opportunities that I and a collection of like-minded people can manufacture at any given point in time.
Right, which is exactly the point of all of this, right? To see, as Charlie also talked about last month, to see what you really care about, what you're driven by. You said your beliefs, things that matter to you, and then what are the opportunities in front of you.
And to recognize that, you know what, long-term plans in an uncertain environment are just nonsense. Right. Now, we've written that, and we've actually gotten a lot of attention and a lot of annoyance out of people who believe that life can be entirely planned.
Yes.
So in that scenario, we actually talked about, you know, the silly question of where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Right. Well, the reality is, why don't you tell me what it would be like if you had that interview at Blockbuster 2 years ago? Okay? Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? And, you know, the obligatory answer is, I'd like to make a managerial move. I'd like to grow with the organization. Well, you know, if you grew with that organization, you wouldn't have a job today. Okay? So the issue becomes one of increasingly, at the same time Just Start came out, Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn, wrote a book called The Startup of You. And what he does is, it really in tandem with what we talk about, essentially say we need to understand that in today's environment, everybody has a responsibility to construct and live a more entrepreneurial life. Okay? And that in fact, okay, entrepreneurship is a necessary life skill. Now, there are a lot of traditional academics who are deeply offended by expanding the definition of entrepreneurship to what we call entrepreneurship of all kinds at Babson, but increasingly people are using entrepreneurship with all sorts of labels. We celebrate that. We think it's just wonderful. If people can absolutely bring the capacity to find and make opportunities as they walk down the street, why can't we call that entrepreneurship? Why can't we be inclusive? Okay, rather than having
Being
hero
this really
worship,
private
you know,
thing
hero
that
worship
nobody
that's
can-
private,
right.
that locks us all out,
Right.
that again,
Nobody can have
you know, that
access.
again has us turn on the TV in the middle of the night, and after reading, you know, after reading Steve Jobs' autobiography and spending a half an hour, you know, thinking about Mark Zuckerberg's hoodie, allows me to say it's just not in the domain of anything I can ever consider. You know what? Both of those are extraordinary people. They have an extraordinary impact, okay?
Yeah.
But the reality
It's not
is,
your way.
for the vast majority of us, the way you get good is to practice, and the way you practice is to take the next step.
Right, and practice the things that you're good at. It's all about each of us.
And
what
develop
matters.
things that you care about,
Right.
okay?
I think that's the hardest
yeah.
part, Len, is having being able to identify what really matters to you
Yeah.
and what you care about most. I mean, most people say, you know, my family, my health,
Right.
you know, I don't know. Those are usually
Right.
the top two things.
Right.
Beyond that, they're like, I'm not
I don't
sure.
know, right?
So I
And
think
and
that's
the
more
reality is,
challenging.
quite honestly, for a lot of people, they've been excluded from the process of actually thinking about what they might want to do. It's all programmed. Okay?
Yes.
Life is all programmed. You know, if you take the standard middle class, upper middle class upbringing, it's you go to the right preschool, you end up in the right kindergarten, you have the right developmental experiences, you do the right after school things, you take the right standardized tests,
Right.
and you demonstrate your capacity as a human being by being able to stand up, raise your hand, get called on, and recite the things that we already know correctly.
Right.
Okay, and there's a marvelous editorial in the Journal of Cell Biology, a magazine that I'm sure that none of your viewers are going to pay attention to. That essentially says, you know, instead of celebrating, reciting things we already know, why don't we raise our hand? Okay, revel in our ignorance and use our ignorance and curiosity to make great discoveries. Okay, and so what we try to spend a lot of time on here at Babson, as well as the arguments we make in the book, is usually you're going to get juiced about something that you and nobody else
And
knows.
so notice where you're juiced.
Yeah, notice where you're juiced.
Yeah, what grabs your attention.
Take a step to see if you can actually figure some things out. And recognize at the core the great breakthroughs, whether it's in an entrepreneurial venture or a family dynamic, usually come from tackling a question that nobody knows the answer to, that you have actually
Including yourself.
energy and desire to take a
put
step on.
towards it.
Yeah.
It's great. So in the last minute we have left, what would you like to leave our viewers with? What one brilliant pearl of wisdom?
You know, you've imposed a great burden that it has to be brilliant. Okay, so if it has to be brilliant, we'll just call it a day and I'll shut down. Okay, but the simplest thing from my perspective is to end where we started, which is that I'm the president of a college that has an entire portion of the college which is devoted to thinking great thoughts, and there's nothing wrong with that. In an environment where we can predict the future based on current reality or the past. That is increasingly not the environment that most people find themselves in. We actually coined a phrase yesterday we were playing with saying, we're living increasingly in a pink slip economy. Okay? And so when you're living in a pink slip economy, you better be able to take responsibility for yourself and your future and not rely on all of the historical support networks that existed in the world or that you fantasized existed. And the only way you can do that is to just start.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us.
Enormous fun. Look forward to engaging with you again.
Thanks.
Great. You made it easy.
Thank you.